don't just fall with armies, they collapse when their money is no longer trusted. First, it was the Dutch guilder, replaced by the British pound. Then, the pound gave way to the dollar. And today, China is knocking on the door. But what happens when the money that runs the world stops being safe? What happens when the empire that prints it loses control? Let's trace the blood-soaked, gold-backed, war-fueled history of the global reserve currency and ask, could America's dollar fall, just like Holland's guilder and Britain's pound? The Netherlands was once the king of trade, its guilder the currency of choice. But by the late 1600s, Britain's industrial power outproduced the Dutch. The guilder bled gold, and the Bank of Amsterdam collapsed under the weight of doubt. By 1784, the guilder lost its crown to the British pound.
In the 17th century, the Netherlands quickly rose to become the world's most powerful nation, overtaking Spain and China. Then it shows that the United Kingdom overtook the Netherlands to become the dominant hegemon in the 19th century. The US rose in the 20th century, and finally we now see the rapid rise of China. Based on this research, Dalio argues there is a detailed pattern that can explain why empires rise and fall. But in the past I've argued that this detailed theory does not hold up very well. However, the pattern that is great power first tends to become an industrial power and then later obtains reserve currency status, that is not very controversial. For example, while the UK overtook the Netherlands as a main trading nation in the late 17th century, it was only in 1784 that the Dutch guilder lost reserve currency status to the pound.
Napoleon tried to cut off Britain's trade. Germany later built more industry, but both failed. Why? Because Britain's pound gave it endless money to borrow and to fund wars. Without global finance, rivals collapsed. Britain held the crown.
Fared slightly better as it hit the first milestone, surpassing Britain's industry around 1870. However, then it mistakenly started a massive war before it has surpassed Britain financially and ultimately found itself unable to borrow much, while Britain used its incredible financial power not just to finance itself but also key allies such as France and Russia.
For hundreds of years, money was tied to gold. If you had paper money, you could swap it for gold. But in 1971, US President Richard Nixon killed that system. The world expected disaster. Instead, the dollar got even stronger.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
As Investopedia explains, Nixon's shock move ended gold convertibility. But the dollar survived. Why? Because America still had the biggest economy, the most powerful military, and the most trusted markets. By the 1950s, the British pound was finished. The US dollar ruled the world. Central banks everywhere chose dollars for two reasons: safety and easy use. And to get dollars, countries had to sell goods to American consumers. The US wasn't just printing money, it was printing power.
According to central bank reserve managers themselves, they choose the dollar over other assets for two main reasons. The first is safety. Safety from getting your assets confiscated and safety from major volatility, as the dollar is one of the most stable currencies in the world. The second main reason is liquidity. Liquidity comes from central banks easily being able to borrow dollars from either the IMF, World Bank, or Fed. But for many developing countries, it also comes from having access to the US consumer. You see, the most stable way to obtain dollars is to export to the US.
In the 1980s, people thought Japan would pass America. In the 2000s, Europe's euro looked like it could take over. But both failed. Why? Because being big isn't enough. People must trust your money.
And in the 1980s, many predicted that Japan would overtake the US. And yet, if we look at the dollar GDP, this is what actually happened. Next we have the European Union, which had a significantly bigger population than the US and overtook US manufacturing output in 2003. And it had an export surplus. No wonder that some expert economists predicted it would overtake the US dollar as early as 2015. However, much like Japan, after a significant challenge to the dollar, Europe's dollar-term GDP stagnated.
As The Economist points out, the euro never managed to push aside the dollar. The lesson? Only one thing matters more than exports: global trust. China's story began in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping opened the economy. He let farmers sell more food, invited foreign investment, and built special trade zones. This lifted 500 million people from poverty and turned China into the world's factory.
Now, while the US is the world's military superpower, China is the world's manufacturing superpower. It has a demographic advantage with more than 1.4 billion people. It's 4 times more populous than the US. Now, in the US, the manufacturing sector employs some 13 million workers. China's employs more than 100 million. It also accounts for more than 31% of global manufacturing output, far surpassing the US.
Now, under Xi Jinping, China wants more than factories. It wants the crown, the reserve currency. Ray Dalio, a famous investor, says this is the classic pattern: trade first, money second, then empire. China talks big, but the yuan still faces huge barriers. Without open markets and global trust, it can't dethrone the dollar. Under Donald Trump, America fought back with tariffs. Factories closed. Orders were canceled. Both sides lost money. China used the moment to call the US unreliable and tried to show itself as the stable alternative.
Xi Jinping is really taking advantage of this moment of Trump's tariffs to portray the US as an unreliable bully. And the opposite is true of how he's trying to portray China. He's trying to portray China as stable, reliable, a defender of multilateralism and a defender of the international economic system.
But history shows trade wars don't create winners. They create losers on both sides. So here's the truth. Money decides power. The guilder fell, the pound fell, and one day the dollar will too. The only question is, who takes the throne? If you want to keep following the brutal fight for money and power, don't just watch history happen. Join us. Hit subscribe, tap that bell icon, and share this video with someone who still thinks the dollar will last forever. Because empires don't warn you when they fall. You only notice when it's too late.